Thank you very much. Buenos dias. I would like to thank Empresarios por la Educación for the invitation to participate in your conference at this very important time for Colombia. It's a little bit stressful for me. I appreciate your tolerance in allowing me to speak in English. No hablo español. I'm juggling a lot of technology. But I hope you're able to make some sense of my comments. So I invite you to fly with me for a little time. This presentation is based on previous work as my role as a UNESCO chair, working on the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report on Education and Conflict, and on lessons learned from working with UNICEF over the past 4 years in a program, a peacebuilding program, looking at the role of education in peacebuilding, funded by the government of the Netherlands, $200 million US dollars in 14 conflict-affected countries. And overall, I'm hoping in the presentation to highlight some of the key messages we have learned about the role of education in peacebuilding, what the key areas are that we need to think about, and more importantly, I think, how will we know if education is contributing to transformation and change as part of a peace process. So if I could begin by highlighting just a few, I think, relevant issues from this UNESCO Global Monitoring Report. It's published each year. It looks at progress globally in terms of improvements in education, in access to education, and in quality. It's an independent report published by UNESCO, and each year it also focuses on a particular theme. I was part of the advisory group in 2011, which worked on the theme of education and conflict. In very broad terms, the report highlighted how conflict is a major barrier to the right to education. Almost half the children in the world who are out of school are in conflict-affected regions. So there are many barriers to education, but conflict is one of the most important. And yet only 2% of humanitarian funding goes to education. We can see globally how the demands are increasing. Refugees are increasing, the conflicts are displacing many populations, and yet the amount of money which goes to making sure that those children who are displaced have education is very small in comparison to other areas. And also the report highlighted in some detail how education can make an important contribution to peace building. If I could, 2 or 3 slides here, simply from the report. This, as I said, indicated how 28 million children are out of school, but almost half of those are in conflict-affected situations. But on the right-hand side, I think, I know, for example, I'm not going to speak about Colombia because I know nothing about I have nothing to say about your system, but hopefully some of these issues may have some resonance for you. I know the latest data from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics says that there are more than 100,000 primary-age children who are not in school in Colombia. And I looked online at the UNICEF report, which was recently published, a report on childhood in the time of war, published in March, which seemed to have more up-to-date figures and statistics. But we also know that children in conflict-affected regions, for example, child mortality rates. If you are a child in a conflict zone, globally, the average under 5 mortality rate is 12 out of every 100 children die before their 5th birthday in conflict-affected countries, and that is twice the average in other low-income countries. And children are also, in conflict-affected countries, more than twice as likely to be malnourished and to suffer from developmental consequences of not having proper diet, proper food, etc. To follow on from what the previous speaker said, I'm encouraged that you're thinking about inequalities. One of the big issues in the report was to highlight how a conflict reinforces inequalities. This chart refers to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It uses data developed for the monitoring report, and it illustrates how countries affected by conflict, inequalities in the conflict regions are reinforced. Within these countries, for example, you can see that those who are in Kivu, North Kivu, is the most conflict-affected region in the Democratic Republic. And for example, in that region, only 32% of 17 to 22-year-olds, 17 to 22% of 17 to 22-year-olds have had less than 2 years of education. And that's 16 times higher than those who live in the capital, who are less affected by the conflict. The other thing this highlights is that whilst boys in conflict-affected areas also are adversely affected by conflict, it is girls who seem to be almost twice as badly affected in terms of not attending school, not having access to education. There are many underlying reasons for that, in terms of security, in terms of parents feeling they don't want their daughters to go to school, to have that sort of a risk. But I think the implications of this information is, supposing you get to the point where there is a peace agreement and you're beginning to try and think about reconstruction, think how much harder it is to reconstruct or rebuild a society or a region if 22% of your young people have only had 2 years education. They have poor literacy, they have poor numeracy, they have poor skills, perhaps in communication. How much harder does that make the challenge, the task of that young generation contributing to the reconstruction of the conflict-affected society? I came across this one and I thought, I'm not sure if it's closer to home. Maybe I'm taking a risk using Guatemala as an example, but I think what this graph shows that over the almost 30-year conflict in Guatemala, if you trace the achievement, the quality of education, the access and the quality of education that different parts of the population received during the conflict from its outbreak in 1964 to the signing of the peace agreement in 1991. There's a number of things to mention here. Those in the conflict-affected regions were obviously achieving much less. The quality of education was poor. This graph particularly highlights how amongst indigenous people, there's also a gap in achievement, which is common in many countries. But also the indigenous people in the conflict zones, you could see that not only was there a gap between the achievement between indigenous people in the conflict zones and those indigenous people not in the conflict zones, but over the whole course of the conflict, the net effect of it was to widen these gaps. So again, creating greater inequalities within the population and potentially building up grievances, maybe resentments for the future that could possibly destabilize the situation again. You mentioned something about finance. I think this next one is quite relevant to finance. Very often, whenever we're looking at reconstruction of education in conflict, post-conflict agreements, certainly there will be assistance, international assistance, I'm sure, from donors. In my own country in Northern Ireland, there were €3 billion invested from the very first ceasefire until up until almost 4 years ago. And that investment went into areas such as education. But that's not usually the pattern. Very often the pattern is that international donors will be there for a short time. They will provide support maybe for the first 5 years after a peace agreement. They will invest large amounts of money. But if reconstruction is only based on that, then when the donor's attention moves to the next crisis or shifts somewhere else, are you going to be able to sustain the reconstruction? So I don't think depending completely on additional international support is ever going to be the solution. This shows that in 21 of the world's poorest and conflict-affected countries, they spend more on security than on education. And this slide was suggesting that if only 10% of that could be redirected into social development after the peace, because there was not so much need for security. If we could demilitarize the situation, there was a demilitarized process in my own country in Northern Ireland. There was a need for less military, less army, less policing, and all those people had to make change and transformation. But it should mean that some of the money that becomes saved from peace, the peace dividend, hopefully can be redirected into social development. Now, will that happen? I mean, military people, security people, I think, are always very good at finding other ways of spending money. So I think, there's a job in terms of pressure on government to sort of say, where is the peace dividend? How is it being used? Is it being used for social development and peaceful, sustainable peace? Or are we simply using our budgets in the same ways as before? If I could turn now to some lessons from the UNICEF research that we have been involved in. As I say, this was a peace-building program in conflict-affected countries in Africa and Asia and Pakistan, places that are some of the most conflict-affected. Colombia was not part of this program. The research, I think, highlighted a number of important priorities. It was making this basic argument. The basic argument is a challenge to what has come to be known as the liberal peace-building formula, which sometimes the United Nations are criticized for. The liberal peace-building formula is you try and get an end to violence, you get ceasefires, you try and engage armed leaders into political talks, you try and reach political agreements for an agreement to move from violent conflict into one where differences are resolved through politics. You maybe change the political institutions, different representation, and you also hope that economic investment will follow from that. But the reality is, 1/3 of peace agreements are broken within the first 5 years. Almost half of peace agreements relapse into violence within 10 years. So our record on sustainable peace is not so good as on making peace agreements. And what are the reasons for that? And some of us who work in development would say it's because if you only concentrate on getting military leaders and politicians to agree, or you only get wealthy elites, create the conditions where they can continue their economic activity, and you only keep violence managed by keeping security in place, then you're not really addressing the causes of the conflict. The former militaries who maybe transform into politicians or the wealthy, then you're not really addressing fundamental underlying inequalities or grievances that people have. And perhaps some of the ways to do that are through social development programs where people who have been most affected by the conflict see improvements in health, in education, in infrastructure, and addressing some of the underlying reasons why there was conflict in the first place. So that is the underlying thesis. And as I say, I would say there are three broad arguments as to why education is important. It's one of the most important areas. I've already mentioned this idea of it being a peace dividend. International research in many conflict-affected countries shows from surveys that high in the priorities, almost at the top of the priorities, alongside safety and security for parents, is education of their children. They want to see benefits, improved education, investment in the education, and the future prospects for their own children, even if they haven't had the same opportunities. And as I say, the challenge for any society is, will there really be transformation? Will the benefits become visible to the poorest and those who have been most excluded? And in many countries, that begins to be a problem further down the line. Secondly, I'm looking here as if I can read Spanish, but I'm only pretending. The second is really, I suppose, whenever people hear about the contribution of education to peace building, very often they think about children, they think about classrooms, they think about things that are quite, they're photogenic. Politicians like having their photographs with children who are involved in activities. But I think education has an important role which is more than what happens in the classroom. Of course, we should be educating all our children to be tolerant, to understand about diversity, but also be critical and to challenge issues, to think critically. All those things should happen at the individual level. But I think we also need to think about the institutions, the education institutions, and the education system, and how they're functioning. Because these also can be difficulties in whether peace is sustainable. I call this the political economy of education. Who controls the education system? Who makes decisions about it? For example, in many conflict-affected countries, and particularly at time of peace agreements, there's often a challenge about how much control remains at the centre, at the national level, and how much goes to the different regions or states or whatever they are. And we know from international experience that there are some stories with lessons to tell. Bosnia, for example, after the Dayton Agreement, education was virtually devolved, decentralized to about 10 cantons. But each of these cantons had its own political elites. It had its own demography in terms of majorities and minorities. They saw education as a way to reward people who were their political supporters through appointments to teaching posts or as principals of schools. They wanted to control what was taught in the curriculum, which was often quite biased towards their own ethnic group. So that is one lesson to look to and say, perhaps decentralization was too much too quickly, because education became very politicized, and it became very difficult for a weak central education system to get agreement between these different decentralized authorities on very important issues, such as how do you guarantee the quality of education qualifications across all of these different. How do you get agreements about what is taught in the curriculum? How do you get a system that allows teachers mobility to move throughout the country to different countries, different states? All these are big challenges, I think. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this. Every country is different. but it's about the balance. And the cautious approach would be, as much as can be agreed centrally, perhaps to start with, and then as trust builds and grows, maybe then it's possible to decentralize a little bit more. But that might not be the case in all other situations. There are other issues about the way the system functions. For example, privatization. Is the growth of privatization in post-conflict societies? This is a sensitive argument in many of these societies. One side of the argument says, in post-conflict societies, things have been destroyed so much, the government is in a poor situation, it doesn't have the resources to rebuild and reconstruct. Perhaps private schools can come in and make up that difference and do a better job. Other people would argue that is undermining the public system. It is creating more inequalities because the access to the private education is more likely to be to those who are well off. And the question from a conflict perspective is, in the long term, would a private and public system in a post-conflict situation, in the long term, is it likely to lead to greater inequalities? And are we going to end up with the rich building walls around where they live, where they go to school, and the poor are attending the public schools and becoming more disillusioned with the government and potentially creating the conditions in which there might be dissatisfaction and conflict as a result of that? So these are important issues. Teacher policies. Are teachers appointed centrally and then can apply, or are they appointed by local authorities, in which case there may be bias or these kind of issues. And thirdly, and I think this is what Carolina was referring to earlier when she indicated how education is one of the most important tools that we have, I think, in order to try and bring about transformation and change. It is the means by which young people get the skills for employment, and that's often highlighted. That's what a lot of people look for out of an education system. But we sometimes underestimate how equally important the role of education is in socialization, in helping new generations understand the social norms. For example, in the relation to violence, how do you deal with conflict in non-violent ways? This is something that schools as an institution, along with families and communities, play a role in modelling what those social norms are. And it is something which can be done across generations. I know in my own society during the conflict, violence became normalised. People were used to seeing brutality. Children became desensitized to violence. They saw it in the streets. It would often be their first course of action if they got into conflict themselves, because they were seeing it. And also if they see it in schools, or if violence is challenged in schools. And again, that was a difficult thing for teachers in Northern Ireland during the conflict. To challenge violence as legitimate was a very difficult thing, because violence brings fear, and teachers are just the same as ourselves. They're fearful perhaps of saying the wrong thing, or of speaking clearly out against violence whenever they don't know what messages their children are carrying home to their parents, who may be involved in, who may not have the same view. Okay, I'll try and move on. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Am I okay? Yeah? Oh, another 20. Okay. Right, I think thinking about the past 4 years and a little bit longer, in terms of my own work, I think there are 4 areas here that we would highlight as being very important priorities for education. and one would hope would be addressed in any post-conflict education plan. The first is about protection of children from violence and creating safe learning environments. We know that organisations such as UNICEF, Save the Children, I'm sure there are many other organisations in Colombia who work in these sort of areas. But protection goes right from what happens within classrooms and what happens within schools and the way in which schools deal with violence that arises in their own institution, right through to attacks on education. You may be aware of a global coalition of international organisations called Protection of Education from Attack. We know it is becoming increasingly common for children to be subject to violence, to be abducted, to be recruited, or to be harmed or killed. Teachers as well. There are many instances of that. And there are organisations struggling with how do we begin to make, in the same way that other public institutions such as hospitals and areas are in some way protected from violence whenever it arises. And that's an important issue. Secondly, the whole issue about inequalities. And I guess in such a large country, you have so many different states and contexts that to expect equality is probably a big, big challenge. But I think, as in all business plans, maybe the best thing to do is to identify where do we think we can make a difference? What is it that we're trying to make a difference to? And how can we monitor it to see if we are making any difference? And I think in most of the conflict-affected countries we've looked at, three key things to monitor in terms of equalities. One is about access to education and strategies to try and improve that. The second is about resources and distribution of resources. And that, is the big challenge politically. If you have conflict-affected areas which have not had investment or where there are big inequalities, then how do you make the arguments, or how do you find the politicians who champion an education strategy which says we need to invest in these areas now in order to try and redress the inequalities that have happened? It may not win many votes, which is part of the problem. Or you may not think it's in the best interests of your constituency or the people who vote for you. But without that, I think then all you're doing is reproducing. It's not transformation. It's not redistribution. And if there's no redistribution, there's no transformation. And it may last for a while, but in the long term, is it going to be sustainable or not? Is it building up problems for the future? And then I think the other important area, and again in my own country was an important area, outcomes. And by outcomes I mean qualifications, skills, qualifications that young people are leaving school with or gathering during their time of school, which will hopefully help them have good livelihoods. Not just employment, but also good, healthy lives, and lives which are lived without the need to recourse to violence. So access, resources, and outcomes, I think, are important to monitor. There are often challenges about gathering data for these. There's often challenges about how objective and independent and unbiased the data is. But I think unless it's in the public domain, I know there are sensitivities that people have, both in terms of do you monitor by region or do you monitor in terms of people's identities, so that you know if minorities, for example, or if girls or particular groups are being more disadvantaged than others. And that's sometimes a controversial thing to do, because some people think, well, maybe what you're doing there is creating, and I use the word probably in the right sense, ammunition for, division and divisiveness. So this is a very, very sensitive thing, even just about what data you collect and how you use that data. Better keep moving. Contributing to social cohesion. I think in this context, there are many definitions of social cohesion. It's one of these terms that can be a little bit elusive, but organizations such as the OECD, for example, do have a whole range of indicators that they say contribute to social cohesion. Ultimately, some of them are to do with crime statistics, how safe people feel in their neighborhood, these kind of issues. But ultimately, there are also a lot of indicators which are to do with trust. And trust, within communities. Do you trust the people in your own neighborhood? And if not, why not? Do you trust people from different group from yourself? Maybe a different social group or a different ethnic group or a different religious group? Is there trust? What would be called, in some people's language, social capital between groups. If there's trust between groups, then you tend to get more economic activity between groups. If economic activity is limited to within groups, then your market's much smaller. If you want to have a market in the whole society of Colombia, then you would hope to have a lot of trust and intergroup social capital. And there are those who are critical of social capital as a concept, but I'm aware of the audience I think I'm talking to. And then there's also the big issue about trust between citizens and the government. And do they feel that things are operating in a way which is to the benefit of all, or to the benefit of only a few? And that's true in education, as it is in any other area of public life. And maybe there's a particular challenge there for how education and how teachers and schools teach. What does it mean to be a citizen of this country? Is it citizenship which is based on your ethnic identity or the region that you come from or something like that? Or is it a concept of citizenship which is based on common rights and responsibilities that apply to everyone, whatever your age, whatever your gender, whatever your color, whatever your ethnic, religious background? Is it possible to educate our young people that all these identity factors are important, but in terms of our relationship to the government and to the state, the most important thing is we all have the same rights and responsibilities? I think that's the key challenge, especially in areas where there has been conflict and it is some of either the identity or the inequalities that have been the underlying causes. Cohesion is also about issues in education such as language of instruction policy. We know that everyone gets a better start in life and learns better if they learn initially in their mother tongue and maybe make a transition then to a national language or to an international language. And that, I think, is also a challenge for education policies. Finally, a big priority, promoting reconciliation. And it's probably the most sensitive area of all, because I don't know any societies which have really successfully done this as part of a post-conflict development. In Northern Ireland, we are 20 years since almost 20 years since a peace agreement. We have no children in our schools anymore who actually saw the soldiers on the streets or saw bombs or violence. And yet we are still struggling, I think, in terms of our education system. How do we teach our new generations who did not experience any of this what the conflict was about? And I don't mean one agreed story. What I mean is, how do we teach them that there are many different interpretations of what this conflict was about, and that's part of the reason why it's been so difficult to resolve. Obviously, there are challenges in teaching history, and when do you teach about this conflict within your system? For many societies in Rwanda, they put a moratorium on teaching history for at least 10 years because they felt it would be too sensitive. In other societies, they've tried to do it through not teaching one single story, but trying to teach the skills of how do you look at different people's interpretations and interrogate them, I suppose, in terms of how much credibility. This is not to say everyone's interpretation of the conflict should be given the same value or the same weight, because some people do fantasize about what conflicts are about. Some people use evidence that is proven to be wrong. So it's about critical inquiry, developing that amongst our young people so that they can look at the different interpretations that are available and them try and make some sense about it. But also them learning, because they didn't have the experience of the impact of violence. One of the things we worry about in my society is part of our peace agreement is that there should be a referendum at some point in our future as to whether Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom as part of Britain, or whether it reunifies with the rest of the island in Ireland. Now, because of the demography, we know that if there was a referendum this year, it would be very, very close. We're not sure on what basis our young people would vote, probably emotionally, or in terms of what their parents tell them to do, or how they identify with their parents. Our worry would be that if they vote only emotionally, whichever way it goes, it could possibly be a trigger for further conflict, because one group would feel that they've lost out. So a referendum may sound like a good mechanism, but if it's too close, it can be a dangerous mechanism. So maybe as educators, what we should be doing is working with our young people to prepare them to vote someday on this issue, but not just emotionally, to ask questions about, would I be better off in one arrangement rather than another, economically, socially, in terms of my mobility. If the UK leaves the European Union and Ireland stays, which way would I want to go as a young person for my future? Okay, I'm getting towards the end. Okay. I was hoping I was getting towards the end, but I need to say more. So I know these are, in a sense, these are very broad statements I'm making. And it's only when they come into different contexts that they actually, you face the challenge of what does this mean in practice? You know, what does building social cohesion mean in practice now in terms of what education should do? What does the equality challenge mean? Through the UNICEF work, we've developed a kind of framework that seems to have been relevant in a number of different conflict and post-conflict countries. And we've called it the 4 R's. Now, I'm very lucky because I'm speaking in English, but you are a Latin-based language in Spanish, and I think these R's work in Spanish as well. And it's really saying, what should we be looking for in terms of transformation and change? What is it what would be the signs that things are changing, rather than just, we've stopped the violence, we're keeping a lid on it. Some of the politicians and the military leaders, they seem to be happy, and the business people are very happy because now they're doing a lot more business and there's no problem with conflict. This framework combines the work of theories of social justice from Nancy Fraser, an American social scientist, and transitional justice theories from work from people such as Brandon Hamber from South Africa and also from Northern Ireland. And it's really saying that what we should be looking for is redistribution taking place? Maybe not just in education, well, particularly in education, but maybe this is something which could apply more globally. It's not just about economic redistribution, maybe about redistribution of access to power, involvement in politics, having a say in things. Is society changing? Society definitely changed in Northern Ireland when the former leader of the IRA, the military group, became the first Minister of Education after the peace agreement. That was a very difficult transformation for people from many different sections of the community. To see the man that they felt had led the armed group that had destabilized a lot of society, now in charge of the education of their children. So there are indicators. That's a very symbolic indicator, but there are also other sorts of indicators about how is there more investment going into education budget? Where's the money coming from? How is it now being distributed? Is it being targeted according to equity? In other words, according to need? Or is it just being distributed equally? In which case everyone gets the same and any inequalities which exist will just be reproduced. So there are questions to ask, I think, in terms of redistribution. Recognition issues, I think, are about how our identities, how our different identities are recognized within education, and I mentioned some in terms of gender, language, politics, where religion features, etc. Representation, and again, if we want more inclusive representation in education, I don't think it can only be about children in schools or even about the management board of schools, where local people in the community might feel that they're more included and have a say. But it's about the administration of education. It's about how two different interests within the society work together in the administration for the benefit of all children, rather than only for the benefit of the children, perhaps from their own group, their own background. What would that look like in Colombia? How would you know if there was more representation, more involvement in decision making? At what level? You know, could you set a few targets? And how would you achieve them as part of an education business plan? How would you measure what the level of change has been over a number of years? I think these are some of the things. We are all very optimistic, I think, at these moments in time when there's possible change. But if we don't put some things in place in order to know if there is actually any change taking place, then we maybe look back 5, 10 years and think, we don't even know if there's been any change. We feel that there's been some change, but we don't know. And then, as I say, finally, reconciliation, and I've talked a little bit about that before. I mean, where there have been truth and reconciliation commissions, very few countries have had the political leadership that has been willing to prioritize implementing the education recommendations. We can understand perhaps why. The truth isn't in everyone's best interests. And anyway, what do we mean by truth? Is there one objective truth? Or is it a matter of my subjective truth? Or your subjective truth? Or is it a matter of some kind of intersubjective truth that we can arrive at? We disagree on some things, but some things we can agree on. It's difficult philosophical issues, but they also have an importance for educators, because depending on what you believe truth is, you will have different resources, you will have a different pedagogy, you will have a different view of what makes up knowledge. Few societies have been able to resolve this. We are all grappling in the dark, but we are hoping that we can find our way, at least when the threat of violence is not there. But there are other ways that education can also contribute to reconciliation. Reparations. I mean, there are many people during conflicts who lose out on education. They don't have the same opportunities. Some societies have decided they will have special bursaries for people who didn't get, maybe only got a few years of education, and even though they're older, they're encouraged to come back into education programs and make up the ground that they lost. Internationally, organizations like UNICEF have programs called accelerated learning, where people, particularly those who are demobilized from conflicts, have an opportunity to catch up through very intensive programs and then re-enter the formal education system. And then there are ethical issues, I think, around the way in which issues about the past and how the education system teaches about it deals with very difficult concepts that we can't pretend our young people will not be hearing. You know, is there talk of amnesty? Is there talk of forgiveness? Is there talk of reconciliation? What do these concepts mean? You know, have our teachers the freedom in the classroom? We often have very intense, you know, academically orientated curriculum. But is there the space within schools? Are teachers the people to be doing this? Or are these issues that should be done through non-formal education, maybe in the wider society? Maybe through the media. Maybe the media has a role here. I know in Northern Ireland, after the peace agreement, one of the issues we had, of course, was that people stereotype. They stereotype those who were in one armed group and those who were in another armed group, or they stereotype the military or the police, or, you know, and a hierarchy of victimhood was part of the difficult discourse and the public discourse. Are some victims more victims than others? If you're the relative of someone who was in the police and was killed, are you a victim just the same as someone who was in a paramilitary group who was killed as well? Should they receive the same support, the families of these groups? From a humanitarian perspective, I guess their grief is the same. But some people find it difficult to accept that equal resources should go to support these kind of victims. So people make distinctions between victims, perpetrators, survivors, and we can't pretend with our young people that these are very difficult challenges. Some would say concessions or trade-offs that have had to be made in order to secure the peace, and for us to pretend that these are not difficult ethical issues or speak with our young people about them is probably not helping them develop a better understanding or a critical way of thinking about society. So I offer no solutions in that area, but simply it is a journey which conflict-affected countries who come to the point of having a peace agreement, I think, eventually realize it's the beginning of new conversations rather than the end. The media, the BBC in Northern Ireland did a very helpful thing in order to try and help us break down some of these stereotypes. After the morning news in the UK and Northern Ireland, morning news programs would run from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. 9 a.m., hopefully everyone's got to work. They don't work on Colombian time. And but what they did was they had, for 2 years after the peace agreement, And it wasn't immediately after, it was a few years once people had sort of got over the initial enthusiasm. They had a little 3 to 5 minute segment at 9 o'clock after the main news bulletin. And it was called Legacy. And it was an open platform where anyone who had a story to tell about their experience of the conflict, whether they were a perpetrator, a victim, whether they saw themselves as a survivor, whether they were someone who just wasn't affected at all because it happened far away from them. And they were given a platform simply to tell their story. And I think what it did, it began to loosen up the discourse in the society. People began to talk about things that they were fearful of talking about before, because conflict-affected societies, I think, we're all very cautious about who we talk to and what we say. But once, the threat of violence goes and we begin to open up these questions, I think the media can have a very important role in helping us do that and see that it's a legitimate and, in fact, necessary thing to happen. So this transforms, I think, into this, which is simply an example of how, using these 4 R's, these concepts, you could identify some areas, some indicators. What is it you want to monitor about potential transformation and change in education over the next 5, 10 years? And then what are the indicators you're going to do about it? I think my final comment here is about, it took us quite a while in Northern Ireland to actually start monitoring transformation and change through the creation of what we call peace monitoring reports. And these peace monitoring reports, they weren't just about education. They looked at changes in the security situation, changes in employment, changes in social indicators, and of which education was one. And I think they were in the public domain, so they were shared, and people were able then to have debates and discussions. They also were a challenge, I think, to government policymakers about whether change was or wasn't happening. I think another important thing is these were carried out not by government. And I'm sure government would be very competent at doing it, but I think sometimes government would like to always to show the best picture. And I think if you're genuinely going to monitor transformation and change, let's say in education, and you've decided on some areas that you're going to look at, then I think you need to think carefully about who is going to do this. And for me, there are 3 criteria. I think it needs to be a body or an organization that is independent. It may cooperate with government. Of course, we will need cooperation from government for access to statistics and data, but we also want the freedom to challenge statistics and data. So it may need to be independent, could be an independent think tank. Academia could have a part to play here if people have credibility. It could be a coalition of NGOs. There are many ways of going about this. But I think independence, credibility, that people will have some trust in what the findings are and the data that's used, but also be critical. Be able to say the difficult things that are not happening as well as the things that are the successes and what is happening. So if anything, that's where I feel, well, I hope that some of what I've said may have some relevance for you. I want to thank you for your attention, and I do hope that the peace agreement is a new beginning for Colombia, and that we will not just feel it and hope, but we will maybe even begin to measure it and monitor it over the next few years. So, muchas gracias.